Hey guys, what is up? Pello here back with another video, and this is kind of the official Season 2 launch video. I just released a video a couple days ago on kind of walking into the raid as like a progression mindset as a Shadow Priest and what to do. This video is going to be a bit more generic for like overall, like walking into the season as a Shadow Priest, like what's the big stuff you need to know. The three big categories we're going to cover today are talents, just kind of general single target rotation, and gearing. This will just be the first of many videos, hopefully, with this season coming out. I do expect, like as normal with the season, there will be some tweaks and tuning, not just to Shadow, but to other specs as well that might affect various choices that we make. So expect to see kind of a more like rigid videos coming out later as things get a bit more finalized. I'll probably do like deep dive videos into the three topics we're going to cover today as like a whole video just dedicated to that. But this video is just meant as kind of like your, week one survival guide for Shadow Priest. And then hopefully as the weeks go on, particularly we'll add more content for like Mythic Plus and that kind of thing once I get a bit more of key practice in under my belt with the season actually launching. Okay. So that's the plan for this video. Expect things to be changed. There is obviously the written guide that's linked in the description. If you want the most up-to-date information, please check that out. And then be on the lookout for future videos if you're watching this like a couple weeks after the season launched. Hopefully we have some newer or more updated videos for that as well. So be on the lookout for that. Okay, without further ado, let's check out talent builds for Season 2. Okay, so if you've watched my kind of previous video on the raid preview, you'll probably know that Voidweaver and Archon are both going to be considered viable or good hero talents to play as a Shadow Priest in Season 2. So in this video, I'm going to give you talent builds for all of these, right? If you want the import codes, the talent build will be linked in the description. You can find all the builds that we're talking about there. Now, as far as builds go, before I show you, this is just a Voidweaver single target build. Going forward, if you weren't aware, the new tier set does affect build changes for Archon specifically, but doesn't really have any impact for Voidweaver. So for Voidweaver, if you're playing it right now, regardless of your tier situation, you can go ahead and use the new builds. Archon has two sets of builds. There's basically the ones from last season that if you don't have any tier or you're still using the Season 1 tier, you should continue to use those builds. And then once you get pretty much the new 4-piece, that kind of unlocks your ability to pick up Idol of Yogg-Saron with Archon, and then you can swap to the new builds at that point. It's possible you could swap when you get 2-piece, when you run 2+2, but that's like pretty break even from what I was doing in my own personal sims. So 4-piece is usually like the cutoff where you'll for sure get that increase by swapping. Okay, so first things first, this is Voidweaver single target build. The big changes from last season are with all the buffs to Void Blast specifically, we're basically indexing more of the build to buff Void Blast damage itself. So Mind Spike makes a return specifically because of Mind Melt. Just kind of passively using Mind Spike as your filler, increases that crit chance for Mind Blast and therefore Void Blast. Getting big juicy crits is really nice. This talent choice becomes a little bit more break even after single target, so it's really good for single target. But once you start adding targets, like swapping these points out for anything else is usually good as well. So if you are doing Mythic Plus, you have a bit more of an option to swap these, but for the most part, single target, we're rocking Spike with Destroyed Reality. Big reason we're playing Destroyed Reality as Voidweaver, with the loss of our tier set from Season 1, we need a little bit more Devouring Plague time to kind of handle the cycle of cast Devouring Plague and then go into Void Torrent. Without that, without the current tier set of Season 1, when you run Mind's Eye, it just falls off too quickly, and then you can't get that first Void Blast out without having to, it's really a tight window basically. So Destroyed Reality just makes that easier to execute. Just slow down the spec a little bit, but again, we're prioritizing Void Blast damage, not getting more Devouring Plagues out because we are playing Dark Ascension. There's no Void Eruption or anything else like that. We just care about uptime, not necessarily cast the Devouring Plague. Now with that, we are making a change to run Darkening Horizon now. And again, the big reason here is, like I just said, we're kind of focusing back onto Mind Blast damage and Void Blast damage. The Rift lasting longer gives you a longer window to do that. And everything else in this build is pretty self-explanatory. Again, you're just taking stuff that buffs Mind Blast, basically. So, obviously, we got a path into Mastermind, Insidious Ire, builds around all of that. Unfortunately, nothing else really synergizes well enough or it is powerful enough. All of the Bender and Inescapable Torment stuff, unfortunately, has never been buffed. This spec has gotten a couple aura buffs, but none of them applied to these spells, and this thing has just kind of fallen off a cliff. Okay, so that's Voidweaver single target build. If we want to add Shadow Crash, which will be pretty common, most fights in the new raid, we want to take Shadow Crash, besides like 1 or 2. All we do is we swap points out of Mind Devour or Phantasmal Pathogen, whichever one you're taking, and then move them into Shadow Crash. Everything else stays, okay? So yeah, Phantasmal Pathogen, we drop those 2 points for Shadow Crash, okay? You could also run Mind Devour if you want, but Phantasmal is usually a bit more consistent with the current damage aspect, okay? Now, for rating builds, we'll kind of switch gears and go to Archon. So again, you do have 2 options here if you're running the old tier or the new tier. I'll show you the old tier build. If you don't have the new tier yet, you can still run this. The notable change here is, we're just not taking Yogg-Saron. Once you get the new 4-piece tier, we swap over to single target. You can see it's adding Phantasmal Pathogen and the Yogg-Saron talents here, because that becomes good enough once you get the 4-piece usually. And from here, if we want to add Shadow Crash, it's going to be very similar. We're again dropping our points with Screams and a couple others just to add Shadow Crash, right? We drop the Screams and drop 1 point in Mind Devour. And that's Shadow Crash. Again, we're just trying to drop as little as we can to take this, because we're still focusing on single target here. And there is the old build as well without Yogg-Saron. You can take that too. If you do not yet have tier, we just move those points in a Mindbender and then Mastermind. If you don't like Bender, which is perfectly fine, you could also play Death Speaker here. Either one is fine when it comes to the old tier. Doesn't really matter, kind of whatever preference that you actually have here. So that's talent builds from like a rating perspective. You want to keep all 4 of those. So single target and single target plus Crash for Archon and Voidweaver. A good Shadow Priest will have both of those ready to play into the raid, and then you're going to swap between whichever one makes the most sense for that fight. Your group, is it progression, is it farm? Again, check out the kind of Liberation guide if you haven't already, either the written guide or the video one, to kind of go over when each one might make sense for you and your group. All right, let's switch gears and talk about Mythic Plus. So for this, there is a bit more choice here, I think. We're talking about rating. Voidweaver's about like 5% ahead in pure single target damage. So it's a bit more of a gap. In Mythic Plus, it's a bit more fuzzy, and that's just because every group key that you walk into is going to be slightly different. So I would keep both of these builds kind of in your back pocket, and then, depending on the group and what you want to try, you can change out. Generally speaking, if you're doing like low-level keys where you're pulling like 1 pack at a time, you're not chaining stuff together, or like pug group type stuff, Voidweaver is typically going to be better for those kind of environments, just because in order for Archon to do its damage well, you kind of have to pull around its big 2-minute cooldowns. Voidweaver, it's a lot easier to you have Void Torrent to press on basically every pack. The only trouble is you don't have as high of burst with Voidweaver as you do with Archon. So that's kind of where that cutoff will happen, is when you stop doing like your weekly 10s and that kind of thing, you start going into like more push keys, or you're chaining packs together, or it's a coordinated group where you know what pulls are coming up when. That's when Archon's really going to start shining. The kind of caveat there is, Archon is behind in single target by about, 4 or 5%. So that is going to be a little bit tricky if you're getting up into those higher level of keys. You also want boss damage, so you got to kind of keep that in mind. I think it'll be pretty similar to what we saw in Season 1. Voidweaver might creep up a little higher than usual. It just kind of depends on the dungeon. Some of them are a bit more akin to you kind of are just pulling 1 pack at a time, and it's harder to chain or things like that, where Voidweaver might still shine. And of course, there is also, if you are still in the Xalatath affix range, when we have the shield affix, like, Devour Matter is still really strong. So realistically, for most players, you should be able to pick Voidweaver or Archon. I would probably default to Voidweaver for most of your keys until you start hitting the kind of push key range, whatever that is for your group. A good kind of rule of thumb here is if you end up trying out Archon, you pull a pack and it dies and Void Form still has like 20 seconds left, right? That's kind of when you're like, okay, I don't know if we're at the right level for this. So this is the Voidweaver build. If we swap over, I'll show the Archon build just to talk through that real quick. Very similar triple idol setup here. Luckily, this season, where we didn't have it at the start of last season, we do have Sustained Potency, which pauses Void Form out of combat. So there is still a little bit of that kind of insurance there. If you are seeing, hey, we pulled a big pack, I still have Void Form running, you'll get to continue that, assuming you've actually dropped combat. So it is pretty good as well, which will make it feel a little bit better in lower keys. So yeah, I think you have a really good kind of set of builds here depending on what you want. More top-end AoE, big pulls around your cooldowns, you want to play Archon. If you're doing weekly stuff, lower key stuff, you want to play Voidweaver, and that's kind of the idea here. Now, to cover, there's kind of options with both of these builds. I'll cover them really briefly. So with Voidweaver, you have a couple choices here. You could drop Mind Spike. It's not as relevant in AoE environments, although again, getting Mind Spike in Destroyed Reality is the kind of preferred choice for more single target. But in Mythic Plus, we're kind of indexing more on AoE. So if you wanted to, you could drop Spike and run Flay instead. With this, you have to pick up Void Touch, Mind's Eye rather, and you could add that point into Maddening Touch for more AoE or Mind Devour for more single target, right? So you do have that choice as Voidweaver in keys. Again, it just comes at the loss of single target damage. Now, alongside of this as well, if you choose to, you don't have to play with Unfurling Darkness. I personally like to, but again, it is less relevant or less required, I would say, in this environment. So you could drop that to pick up Maddening Touch for more AoE or Unfurling for more single target. Those are the two big choices that you can make. If you really want to go full AoE with this build, or as full as you can really get, you pick Void Touch, you can go Mind's Eye, you add that point back into Maddening Touch. This is like what a Flay build example will look like. Again, the only problem is you're sacrificing some Void Blast damage here, but you are getting just kind of in general that extra Insanity Gen, more Devouring Plagues, all that kind of stuff, okay? So that is the option with this build. I think for most people, though, this will be kind of a good default. Now, noted, because this is playing Destroyed Reality, a lot of you are asking, does that mean we're spreading Devouring Plague now? The answer is no. While you could spread with Destroyed Reality, it is a requirement to run this talent to spread. It's not required to spread with this talent, if that makes sense. So we still want to dump this into the high priority target, only refresh when it's absolutely necessary. That same rule kind of applies. Now, switching gears to the Archon build, this was very similar to what you're running in Season 1 because we were already playing a triple idol for most Archon stuff. The hybrid build that we had in Season 1 where we drop Yogg-Saron isn't really needed anymore just because of the way the new tier set works with Yogg and single target. It's still very viable. So this is really just kind of the standard build that you'll run here. The other option that I will mention is if you do want more AoE instead of more single target, you could move this point of Mind Devourer into Maddening Touch. I wouldn't drop anything out of Dark Evangelism. You could drop the Ancient Madness point if you really want to, if you really like Maddening Touch for the AoE damage. Obviously, if you don't need Silence and Mental Fort, you could drop that, but all these builds will suggest that by default. But I like Mind Devourer here, plays really nicely, helps out with the single target. But if you are in the massive key, push keys stuff, Maddening Touch does just get better as you add targets. Okay, so that is our kind of talent builds in a nutshell this season. Again, if you want links for all of these, it'll be in the talent page on the Icy Veins guide. There is also a section for preseason builds. If you don't have tier yet, you can click on that to get those older builds. All right, let's cover the rotation for both Voidweaver and Archon. In the background, you'll be seeing me kind of doing just a simple single target opener. I'll do the Voidweaver one first. I did actually get super unlucky in this clip, and hopefully this will kind of help showcase what to do when this happens. As a Voidweaver, we're kind of playing around the Shadowy Insight talent, which gives you a random reset of the Mind Blast charger that you're going with. Unfortunately, like I said, I kept getting lucky, and I would get this proc mid-Void Torrent, meaning I was able to kind of know when my proc is happening. The biggest thing to kind of learn to play around with Voidweaver is your kind of Void Blast charges and keeping up your Devouring Plague uptime. So with this, you're kind of, the rotation is built here to maximize getting all of those casts out as much as you can within that Entropic Rift window. So you can see here, I did get that a couple of times. If you don't end up getting that proc, you're kind of gambling of when it will actually happen. And the idea is you want to spend your Void Blast basically as soon as you can to make sure you're not wasting any if you happen to get a Shadowy Insight proc. Now in this case, because I did get that proc, I went ahead and weaved in some extra Mind Spikes to get that extra crit damage on the Void Blast. You can kind of play around with that risk depending on how comfortable you are with the spec. But for the most part, we're here just to full send Void Blasts as much as we can, assuming Devouring Plague is on the target. Now, other than that, from when it comes to Voidweaver or Archon, you still have your simple goals in mind with the spec. If you can handle these goals, a lot of the stuff should just fall in kind of naturally, and you kind of want to play around them as much as you can. start with these first and then go through the rotation guide below to kind of get the more in-depth of like, this is more important than this and that kind of thing. But really, the goals are the same as they've always been for us for the last couple of seasons. Maintain Vampiric Touch, Shadow Word Pain at all times on as many targets that you care about. And then you want to maintain uptime of Devouring Plague. Again, we care about uptime here. So you really only want to recast it when you're about to cap on Insanity, meaning you're like at 80 or 90 Insanity, or the dot is about to fall off or falling off. That's when you press Devouring Plague. You don't just want to slam it whenever you get it, although that can be okay inside of like specific cooldowns, but we really care about uptime of the dot for things like Insidious Ire or our Mastery. The next goal is to use all of our kind of short cooldown, like Insanity generation spells as much as we can without capping on charges or losing out on procs and that kind of thing. So, you know, if Mind Blast is sitting at 2 charges, if Surge of Insanity procs are at 4 charges, right? Like, those are the things you want to prioritize using that stuff before you lose them. Or if they're sitting there not cooling down, that means you're wasting potential casts of that in the future. And then the next goal that you have is just using those big long cooldown spells to make sure you're not losing uses of them over the fight. So if you know that the fight's only going to last like another 30 seconds, hey, you should probably slam all the rest of your cooldowns and not hold. Versus, hey, if you know that the fight's going to end in a minute and you have Void Eruption available, maybe it makes sense to save it for like 10 or 15 seconds to line up with like an ad phase or something else like that, right? So really that goal is just meant to use as many cooldowns as you can, as often as you can, without losing uses, but lining them up where they make sense. As far as Voidweaver is concerned, it still kind of takes into account all that stuff. There is a bit of Unfurling Darkness weaving here in that kind of beginning opener. Just note that if you choose not to play with Unfurling Darkness, that is okay. It's about a 1% DPS loss, but if you choose to do that as a Voidweaver, you do want to make sure you cast a couple Mind Spikes before you cast your Dark Ascension, so that when you cast that, you're open to cast that Devouring Plague before your Void Torrent. It's very important to have that Devouring Plague ready to hit before you actually go into that Void Torrent window. And again, once you're inside the Entropic Rift window, again, your priority is hitting Void Blast as many times as you can. You can kind of freely spend Devouring Plagues while the Rift is active, but as soon as the Rift ends, even if Dark Ascension is up, you kind of want to go back to conserving Insanity for Devouring Plague only when it's about to expire, or you're going to cap on Insanity. You know, during that window, you can be weaving in spike casts. You can also cast Unfurling Darkness if you have nothing else to press other than just like a vanilla Mind Spike. Kind of depends. There's lots of good choices there depending on what you're doing. So be sure to kind of check out the kind of priority list for all that stuff. All right, now let's cover Archon. A lot of this is going to be very similar if you've played Archon in Season 1. Nothing is really changing with this. The goals we talked about earlier still apply to Archon. Main changes here, instead of focusing on Entropic Rift with Voidweaver as Archon, you're focusing more on Halo. You're going to play Void Eruption almost all the time as Archon. So with that, the opener is going to look a little bit more simple, to be honest. It is kind of a bit more natural to play, at least for me personally. If you've played Shadow at all in the past, just feels a little bit more natural. But I think they're both pretty straightforward once you get the hang of it. So you're going to start with Halo here. You go into Precast Vampiric Touch. The only kind of trick here that might trip you up here is we do want to dump our Mind Blast charges before casting Void Eruption, because Void Eruption will reset those charges. We want to get that, the extra Insanity to start out with, and that reset will come later. Once you get into Void Eruption, your priority is to get Void Torrent off on cooldown as soon as you can. So cast that Void Bolt, get Devouring Plague up, and then send the Void Torrent. That extra buff that we get with Ancient Madness just makes it tick better, and then we can use that Insanity to fuel the rest of our rotation. Void Torrent is just a strong damage spell. If you wait too long to press it, you're just losing out on damage. And then for the most part, this entire spec is just juggling, not capping stuff while you're in your cooldowns. The exact priority list isn't super needed here. You can kind of just intuitively say like, hey, if you have Void Bolts available, you should press that for sure. If your Surge of Insanity charges are at 3 or 4, you kind of want to prioritize using 1 or 2 of those to make sure you're not actually capping how many of those you have available. Same thing with Mind Blast. If Mind Blast is capped on charges, you probably want to weave that in just for the Insanity generation. We're pretty much pressing Devouring Plague when we have nothing else to do. We can kind of full send that in our cooldowns to sustain Void form and get more Surge of Insanity procs. And then you also have, most builds are going to be taking Death Speaker. You want to weave those in as much as you can to not waste them. That one's going to be the hardest thing to do just because there's so many things on this list. Just know if you're not capping anything, you're playing Archon as well as you can. It's a lot of procs that could happen. If you get like lucky with Shadowy Insights or Death Speakers, you know, things could happen a bit faster for you. If you are struggling to feel like you're not able to keep up as fast, one thing that you can change with the opener is move the halo to be closer to Void Eruption. There is kind of an optimization there of like when we're actually pressing halo. You can push it back to be right before Void Eruption or even shortly afterwards. Doing that just gives you a bit more time before you're getting flooded with Surge of Insanity procs. If you can learn to press it a couple GCDs before Void Eruption, that's good. But to slow things down a little bit, you could press the halo as the cast right before Void Eruption to make that a little bit simpler. So that is an option for you to consider as well. Otherwise, you know, Archon's going to play pretty similarly. The priority list will be linked below. All right, from a gearing perspective, there's going to be a lot to cover. I'm going to try my best to get through this, but the written guide will have all the kind of nitty-gritty details. But I wanted to cover some of this just so you have a bit to walk into the new raid. Okay, so when it comes to our overall gear set, this is one example of kind of a raid set that you can put together. Kind of a couple of highlights here that I want to let you in on. First off, when it comes to embellishments, we're still going to generally want to run Ascendance and the Writhing Armor patch going into this raid. What pieces you use in terms of like your crafted gear progression will change up this season. Before it was pretty clear that we wanted to craft a two-handed first, just with a combination of sparks and how expensive crests are. But they have reduced the actual crest acquisition, so it is cheaper to craft from a crest perspective. And they've also added an extra week, I think, to getting that actual second spark that you need to craft the staff. So it might make sense for you to craft, you know, the offhand and upgrade that from season 1, or go with like a belt or a cloak to start out with. There's lots of correct choices in there. It really just depends on what your gear is and what you would spend the crests on otherwise if you were not crafting something. But when it comes to kind of full bis, eventually we're going to want to craft it offhand. Something in the wrist slot or belt slot, feet slot, all those are okay as well for that Writhing Armor patch to double Ascension. The reason why we're going to do that again, it's competitive, but for the most part, it's because of this one-handed weapon from the raid that is looking to be best in slot for us. It's mostly a single target damage proc here that just passively happens. Stats are fine for us. It is kind of a rarer drop off of Muggsy, and it is a mace, so it's not super contested in terms of other casters, but it is something that we're going to want to play. As far as Mythic Plus, it's definitely a lesser impact. You're going to expect like maybe 1% damage in raid. Mythic Plus, it's going to be lower. It's definitely not as good as that. But this is like, you know, it's just free damage, right? It's got full secondaries, full stats, nice free damage proc on this. It does deal shadow damage, and as of right now, Voidweaver does get increased shadow damage during Entropic Rift, so it is a little bit better for Voidweaver, but not a crazy amount. Other things to talk about with gearing, from a tier set perspective, we would ideally drop the leg slot. The first boss in the raid drops Haste Mastery legs, so these are going to be super easy to get like early on in Mythic. So that's why we generally don't use legs, because these are just so valuable. You could also end up dropping the hand slot as well. There's plenty of good gloves this season. Either one is fine, but I think most people will end up using these legs and dropping the tier legs for it. Other things with gearing to cover are the rings. There were a couple nerfs to Cersei's Circlet a couple days ago, or last week if you're watching this later on. This ring is still best in slot for us. The change here that we made, we dropped the Skipper's Gem and we added Wind Singers. So this ring will continue to be best in slot for us. It is roughly equivalent to like a full Mythtrack 678 ring with best stats. So depending on your gear set, you might be able to drop this at some point, but it is looking a little unlikely for most of our gear sets. You're going to want to be able to run this. A little bit of a eye level hit for sure. If you do end up getting really competitive rings, you could consider dropping this, but it's likely going to be like margin of error 0.1% kind of thing here. So still a really good ring for us. Notes here with Wind Singers, it doesn't matter if Haste or Mastery is your highest stat, it's still best in slot. There's not one that's particularly better. maybe a little bit lean towards Mastery if you're Voidweaver, and if you're in Mythic Plus, they're kind of even, but really, our stats look very similar to how they have in previous seasons. We like Haste and Mastery almost equally, right? So not really a big deal at all. We also like the Jaster Diamond Ring. A lot of people are going to like this. It does make it harder to add more haste into the spec because it is so mastery heavy, but it drops off of Gallywix. It's going to probably take a while for us to get this. So in the meantime, while you're gearing up, you can rock this Football Championship ring, or plenty of other good rings this season. I'll show them in the ring section below. I'll cover trinkets in just a second, but this is kind of just like the general gearing guide here that we'll kind of start with. All right, let's talk about trinkets. So I'm not going to cover every trinket here. There is kind of a section here that goes over, top trinkets for rating, top trinkets for Mythic Plus. A little note on some time walking trinkets if these come up. There's also some delve trinkets, so we'll hit those in just a second. But let's cover rating trinkets. So first off, the best trinket that we can possibly get this season is going to be Mug's Moxie Jug. Even though crit is not our best stat, we still scale with crit just fine, and this thing is just really strong right now. It's a passive trinket. You want to get your hands on this as soon as possible. You're pretty much going to want to run this the entire season, and it's going to be use Mug's Moxie Jug plus something else, and that's going to be kind of the go-to combo for this season. And that's going to apply for rating or Mythic Plus. Mug's is just going to be that strong. Now, the trinket you pair with it, you have lots of really good options this tier, which is great. I'll kind of mention a couple just to start us off here. So Signet of the Priory, really strong on-use trinket from the Priory dungeon. This guy does get better the more people that are also using it. I don't know how popular it's going to end up being for other casters or other, agility, strength. Probably won't like it that much. But if you do find yourself in a group, particularly in Raid, should be easier. If more people are using this, it does get pretty good. So you'll probably see a lot of really good combos with Mugs and Signet for that reason. If you are the only person using it, it does drop a little bit in value, although not too much. Still one of the best on-use trinkets that we have this tier. So that is definitely a solid option. There's also Eye of Kazan. This is kind of the passive version of Spy Masters that we had from Season 1. This trinket is going to be really strong on progression fights. So if you just do like standard 5-minute, plus minus 20% variance sims, it's going to sim pretty okay, but not like turbo great. But if you're talking about progression fights where things go to like 6 minutes, 7 minutes, 10 minutes, or whatever it may be on the last boss, Eye of Kazan will keep getting better the longer that you're in combat. I think it plateaus at like 6 or 7 minutes, something like that. But yeah, really strong progression trinket. It is something you'll likely see people drop when it comes to farm. And then unfortunately on Mythic Plus, I haven't done as much testing with it, but it was really hard to keep up stacks of this. They do decay out of combat, and I don't think we're going to be able to keep that up fast enough. If you can, it'll be really great in Mythic Plus, like beyond S tier, but I think unless you're chain pulling like really, really quickly, it's going to be really tough. But still a good option for progression rating. A couple other ones that I want to mention for rating. The first one we'll talk about is Synergistic Brutalizer. This guy is currently over-simming a little bit. It is quite strong just naturally. The damage proc seems very good. And the kind of extra cherry on top for Shadow Priest, it spawns a barrel that you kill. And if you kill it, you get Twist of Fate, which is a nice little 10% damage bump. It does help with Twist of Fate uptime. It's kind of like the little cherry on top of this trinket. It doesn't make it BIS necessarily, but it's really strong. The only caveat is you do have to actually kill the barrel, and it does depend on where it spawns if it actually hits the target that you care about. So in a raiding environment, it still should be strong, but with how bosses and ads are moving around, it'll be hard to get really good use out of. But honorable mention, A tier trinket for sure. The other trinkets to mention, we'll start with House of Cards. This is another on-use trinket. It is a 90-second cooldown though, so unlike Priory, we don't get as like full value out of this trinket. This thing is super competitive. I think almost everyone's going to want this. So it might be hard to get your hands on it, but if you could, it's still a great on-use trinket this tier to wave in for raiding encounters. It does also have a little bit of sustain added to it. The more times you use it, up to 3 times, you get a little bit more mastery when you actually use the trinket. So it gets better for that kind of execute portion of fights. So really strong raiding trinket if you care about progression as well. And the stacks are easier to keep up in Mythic Plus too. So really solid trinket to get your hands on if you can from raiding. The other one to mention as well, this is mostly for gearing up, is the Prize Gladiator's Badge of Ferocity. This guy only goes up to champion track in season 2, and you get this from doing like arenas or battlegrounds, like the rated PvP stuff. It's pretty cheap to buy, but it's a 1-minute cooldown on use trinket, which means it's really good for Voidweaver because you can just use it every single Dark Ascension window, and it lasts for 15 seconds. It's pretty strong. Not best in slot by any means, but it is really nice for gearing up. So if you are bored at the start of the season and you want a little break from doing keys, adding this in is going to be really great for your Voidweaver builds, at least to start out, until you get better trinkets. So there's also plenty of others to cover, but that's kind of rating trinkets in a nutshell. All right, I already talked a little bit about Mythic Plus, but just a couple of things to mention. House of Cards gets good because it's easy to keep these stacks up in most dungeons. Some of them it's harder than others. The Bruturializer should be easier to play around to get that big AoE damage, although again, it might be hard to spot. In the guide, if you go to scroll down to the Bruturializer section, there is a macro that you can use to like simply kill the barrel and swap back to your last target. I also have a weak aura that someone made that puts a timer next to their nameplate. And I have a plater script that changes the color of the nameplate of the barrel just to make it easier to play around. So you can definitely check this out if you haven't seen that. But yeah, as far as S tier trinkets, all that's going to be pretty similar. Signet of the Priory is still strong. It's just going to be harder to get other people that also have the trinket. There's also that kind of downside of like, depending on the key level, if multiple people are sending their cooldowns at the same time, which is when Priory gets the best, the pack dies faster, and that's not necessarily a good thing. So that one's a little tough to work in. There's also Soul Letting Ruby, which is kind of a returning trinket that a lot of you, if you played back in Shadowlands, will remember. This trinket isn't quite as strong as it was back then, but it's still really good if you can snipe off low health targets. Even in raid, to be honest, it's still pretty solid. Just depends on like when you can do that, what part of your burst it is. So there's a lot to play around with this trinket. It has a potential really high highs here. It's just kind of a bit more complicated than just like, hey, bind this to Power Infusion and get good damage, right? But that's still a competitive choice here as well. And then the next thing I'm going to talk about before we move on, we'll cover Delve Trinkets in a second. Spymaster's Web, it was nerfed several times. It's likely going to be something that you're going to replace early in the gearing process, like end of normal, like high champ tier, low hero tier. You'll probably swap this out. But for progression encounters, it still could be pretty nice just to build up stacks and get that burst on demand when you want it. So if you still have it from Season 1, I'd keep it around. It's probably going to be good for prog. Okay, I want to cover Delve Trinkets. This is something that comes up every season. So early on in the gearing process, we'll probably be doing some Delves. Delves can drop champion gear. If you have a map, you can get some hero track gear. And then in the vault, it drops hero track gear. So this is really important. These trinkets are very competitive because they are better than their eye level suggests, okay? Now, for all of these guys that are listed, they are not strictly speaking best in slot, but they are really good as you're gearing up waiting for those best in slot trinkets, right? So if you're doing delves, it's a good idea to keep these guys in mind. And, you know, I listed like the top 5 for like rating a Mythic Plus. There are some other ones as well. Just note that if you get these, you know, you should definitely consider them competitive. And they might even out-sim a trinket. Like if you have Mug's Moxie and it's only a normal version, you know, a hero track version of Suspicious Energy Drink might actually sim a little bit better, especially if you're low on mastery. So, you know, some of these things can like transcend as you're comparing, because just because a trinket isn't S tier or A tier doesn't mean it's better than another trinket at a higher item level, right? So you have to keep that into account, sim things as much as you can, but keep an eye out for the Suspicious Energy Drink, Concoction Kiss of Death, Shadow Binding Ritual Knife, the Quick Candlestick, and Funhouse Lens are the big ones. There is also an Amorphous Relic. The link isn't quite working. That one seems to be good as well, especially for keys, but these are kind of the go-to to keep in mind for trinkets. Alright guys, there's lots of other stuff in the gearing page if you haven't seen it, talking about stats here, simming yourself, good rings, weapons, all that good stuff here as well. If you aren't sure what you can catalyst for, there's plenty of info on this, and a lot more detail in the kind of craft section that we talked about earlier. But that's all I'm going to cover in this video. I've already been ranting for quite some time now. Hopefully this was a good enough starter to get you into Shadow Priest this season. Again, the written guide has lots of good information that I'll keep up to date. Let me know in the comments down below what you would like to see in upcoming videos this week or next week. I will do my best to get things through as I'm progressing through things myself. So thank you so much for watching, and we'll catch you in the next video.